You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
My name is Pete Boettke. I'm the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. We have a weekly workshop in philosophy, politics, and economics that's been running for the last 17 years in the Department of Economics, and will continue this year. It meets every Thursday from 2 to 3:30, and you can find out information on the website and whatnot. But one of the things that we do with my colleagues Claire Morgan and Virgil Storr and Chris Coyne is we work to set up also these book panels when various people that are in our network come out with books that we think are significant. And we're kicking off our workshop this year with a book panel on one of our illustrious alum, Ed Stringham, and his book, Private Governance. Just as a little personal note before we get going, I actually credit Ed with a lot of the invigoration of the Austrian economics program at George Mason University among the students, because for a variety of accidents of history, a lot of the faculty who had historically been in the Austrian economics program left to go to the School of Public Policy and to create another organization in the 1990s. And so the student population kind of dwindled in their excitement about that. And then Ed and Virgil came in 1998 to start a program. And I remember in the very first session when I ran my workshop, someone mentioned Milton Friedman, and Ed was there, and Ed said, "Yeah, he's a socialist." And everyone looked at Ed, and, "What's that about?" Because Ed was curious, and he was a curiosity. He drew a lot of people to his attention. He got all these people, and right before Ed decided he was going to graduate, he told me that he started an alternative Austrian society of which I would not be allowed to be a member. So that was kind of interesting as well. But Ed has gone on to do great things, and he is now the Davis Professor of Economics and Organization and Innovation at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He is the current president of the Society for the Development of Austrian Economics, the group he wanted to revolutionize and overturn. I guess he worked with inside. He read his revolutionary cadre well enough, I guess. He's the former president of the Association of Private Enterprise. He's the editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise, the editor of 2 books, and the author of more than 60 journal articles, book chapters, and policies. He's appeared on CBS, CNBC, CNN, Fox, Headline News, NPR, and MTV. He's also famously has a second career as an actor. He was in the rap video. He was the reporter who loved John Maynard Keynes. And he also was an extra on several movie and TV shows. And I asked him how he gets on those, and he says, central casting. They call me all the time. And his book, Private Governance, all right, is now published with Oxford University Press. And Ed is doing a bunch of very interesting work on this, including work not only in private police systems, but also governance systems in financial markets and other things. So he'll talk about that. The way this is set up today, Ed will give a presentation of his book. It'll be around 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will hear from 2 commentators, illustrious and very well-selected commentators for this particular project, who have done their own work that's significant in this area. So we have Jason Brennan, who is just recently established the Flanagan Family Chair and Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business. And he's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. and he, before that, was associated with the Political Theory Project in the Department of Philosophy at Brown University. Jason has written 6 books in 6 years, and he specializes in political philosophy and applied ethics. Then we have Bruce Benson, who is the DeVoe Moore Professor and Distinguished Research Professor and Professor of Law at Florida State University. His book, Enterprise of Law, is one of the classic works that set in motion a lot of the discussion that works like Pete Leeson and Ed Stringham have pursued in their career. He is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. He's recently been a Fulbright scholar over in the Czech Republic. Next year, he will be a visiting professor at the Ben Powell's Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University as well. All right, so I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to turn the podium over to Ed. Then we'll hear from Jason and then Bruce, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, Pete, for the very kind words, and thank you so much for organizing this. I'm very honored to be here, and thank you, Jason and Bruce, for coming here. Really honored to have you be commenting on my paper, and thank you all for coming to listen to me. The topic that I'm going to be talking about, highlighted in my book, is how are markets possible? In the world right now and throughout history, there's always going to be the possibility of problems like fraud or predation. So what are the institutional prerequisites for markets to exist? So what I'm going to do is summarize the issues, and then I'm going to go in and give some examples from history and from today, and then talk about the implications. So the most common position is that you need to have contracts and other types of exchange. You need to have government to enforce laws. And this is popular even among a high percentage of anarchist libertarians who emphasize the need for judicial enforcement, albeit private. And the basic idea behind this is the world is fraught with prisoners' dilemmas. And even though people might have an benefit from cooperating, they're going to have an incentive to cheat. So the idea is the government's going to step in and pass laws against problems like fraud. And these external prohibitions are going to enable more trade to take place. So I'll just give you a couple quotes on this. Kirzner says, without enforceability of contract, the market cannot operate. It follows that those institutions cannot be created by the market itself. The market needs governmental extra market enforcement. Richard Epstein, another classical liberal, law is critical to offer a secure framework for voluntary transactions to take place. One would be a naive visionary to believe that markets could operate without any support from the state. And then other classical liberals, including Doug North, will say, well, maybe you can have certain simple types of exchange without government enforcement, but realizing the economic potential of gains from a trade in a high technology world require third-party enforcement. He says a coercive third party is essential. And then Mancur Olson also argues, he says, most of the gains from transactions like those in a capital market require impartial third-party enforcement. Okay, so that's the standard view. Markets cannot solve problems like fraud. Governments are able to solve problems like fraud. Therefore, government enforcement is necessary. So thanks so much, everybody. I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of the research that I did that went into this book, Private Governance. And I'm going to contrast my approach with what Oliver Williamson calls legal centralism, which says whenever a problem exists, government must solve it. And Oliver Williamson says, most studies of exchange assume efficacious rules of law regarding contractor disputes are in place and applied to the courts in an informed, sophisticated, and low-cost way. And I'm going to ask whether that actually is the case in the current world, and suggest that in many cases, any one of those problems is present, and oftentimes many of them are present. Okay, so the first thing is using government is costly. That's just the first thing that we need to recognize. In many cases, government doesn't devote resources to a particular area. Even if they do, using the legal system is costly. It costs you time to call up the cops, it costs you time to go to court, call your lawyer, etc. Pete, am I allowed to tell this story? So I was in Prague with a professor of mine, and this is in 2000, and we just arrived, and we went to go get some drinks, and this professor of mine went to put his ATM in the machine, and something happened where it was in the opposite order of American machines, where they got the money, or no, they gave him his card, but not the money, and then he was just waiting there. He's like, well, where's my money? And they thought he left his card, so it sucked his card back in, and then the machine closed. Like, it's like totally, and this professor was freaking out, and he's like, oh my goodness, where's my ATM card? It's Friday night, the bank's not gonna be open till Monday. And he's a free market guy, but his initial reaction, I kid you not, is, oh, let me go get help from those cops over there. And I'm like, what? Why is GE Capital going to be giving the keys to their vault to the local cops? And I was like, no, don't do this. We're going to get arrested. But he went over and talked to the cops, and they obviously didn't help him. And the reason I mention this story is even free market economists have this kind of assumption that government's going to be able to step in to solve the problem, and in many cases, they just don't have the resources to do so. Okay, so that's an important thing. We cannot assume government is this deus ex machina that is going to solve all of our problems. The next problem I want to highlight quickly is government may be aware of a problem, but might not know how to best solve it. Okay, so economists have pointed out that government planners are not omniscient, and we can ask the same thing about law enforcers. The people who are regulating markets or enforcing contracts in markets might not understand how to solve the problems at hand. So one of my least favorite moves is the Occupy Wall Street movement. I got to see them every day when I was in New York. And they'll have a bunch of claims of what government needs to do. So here's one. We need to outlaw credit rating agencies, immediate across-the-board debt forgiveness for all, debt forgiveness of sovereign debt, commercial loans, home mortgages, home equity loans, credit card debt, student loans, personal loans now. So this is kind of a curious set of economic requests. But then when you ask them basic questions about economics, they can't answer any of them. Who's the chairman of Federal Reserve? 40%, 42% don't know. Only 38% could answer. What is the SEC? 68% says don't know. What is Dodd-Frank Act? 84% don't know. Okay, so for an economic movement, their knowledge about economics is not that good. And then you'll have the people in charge of the regulatory agencies, Elizabeth Warren, saying, without irony, I created much of the intellectual foundation for what they do. Okay, so we can ask, does government have the knowledge? Does government have the incentive to solve problems? In many cases, they don't. And I don't need to focus on the public choice arguments here, but the idea is even if the government cares about something, they might have their own interests that they're pursuing, and they're not interested in helping you out. And in some cases, government has much more malevolent interests. They're not interested in protecting the public. Okay, so government's not a deus machina, and so that means we can either live with a problem or attempt to solve them. Okay, so that's going to be the theme of what I'm going to highlight over the next few minutes. Unmet needs create a demand for solving a problem. So I'll tell you a true story. This happened. I was bidding on these ties, and I won. And it turns out that one of them was Paisley. And it wasn't in the picture, but they sent me a Paisley tie. And I can't wear Paisley. It's the worst thing in the world, and it would just ruin my life. So after a lot of tears, I decided to call up the guy who sold it to me and say, I'm sorry, I didn't order Paisley tie. No response. And he just wouldn't respond to my emails. So then I decided to call the cops. And I'm like, go get him. Go get that guy. They didn't want to do it. Called the FBI. They didn't want to do it. Called my senator. Nobody took my calls. Actually, the first part of the story did happen. I did get this Paisley tie that wasn't in the picture. But who did I call instead? eBay. Right? eBay is a private club that creates and enforces rules for their marketplace. And I'm going to highlight the good part of James Buchanan, his economic theory of clubs. And here he and I are at Arby's, of all places. And then apply that thinking from the reason of rules to clubs. So it's very easy to think about how eBay can adopt various rules, weighing the marginal costs, marginal benefits of rules. So this is a simplified diagram, but assume there's decreasing marginal benefits of any given set of rules, increasing marginal costs. Well, let's figure out the optimal set of rules, and then eBay can solve those problems within the club. They have an incentive to maximize the net benefit of the rules for the benefit of their marketplace. And they have an incentive to not have too many rules, have an incentive to not have too few rules. And so let me just go through some quick examples in history to just show how private people do this type of thing all the time and solve very complex problems. So this first set of research was from when I was at George Mason University. And in 17th century Amsterdam, in 18th century London, and 19th century New York, all of these markets, government really didn't understand them. They didn't choose to enforce contracts in them, and brokers figured out how to make contracts in them nevertheless. So 1600s, we've got a very sophisticated market, and even though none of the contracts were enforceable, brokers figured out how to engage in short sales, forward contracts, options contracts, hypothecation, securitization. And what they did was they relied on reputation mechanisms. And I'll give you a quote from Adam Smith in 1 minute. But when you're dealing with people many times in a day, you can't cheat and expect to gain business. And we have that mechanism also being applied in London, where they use reputation mechanisms plus more formal private dispute resolution systems. So Adam Smith says buying stocks by time is prohibited by government, yet he says all great sums that are lost are punctually paid. Why is that? He says persons who game must keep their credit, else no one will deal with them. It's quite the same for stock jobbing. They who do not keep their credit will be turned out in the language of Change Alley called a lame duck. Okay? And he goes on to describe how it's reducible to self-interest. If you want to be successful in business, you've got to follow through with your word, because people can convey reputation mechanisms about you. In addition to the basic reputation mechanisms, they also relied on chalkboard. They would write your name on the board and physically exclude you from the coffee house over time. In addition to excluding people who defaulted, they had membership requirements where you had to be reputable. In addition to that, they had an arbitration system to try and resolve disputes within the coffee house. I mentioned coffee house in the the London Stock Exchange. It was a private club, and it was called New Jonathan's Coffee House. They would trade in informal settings. They eventually called it the Stock Subscription Room, and they adopted as their motto, "My word is my bond." They also did this in New York, in Philadelphia, tons of other places, the markets created private clubs to exclude the unreliable. Lloyd's of London, same type of thing, used to be called Lloyd's Coffee House. In New York, it used to be called Tontine Coffee House. They had private rules and regulation. A lot of the modern disclosure requirements that we think about were private innovations by the New York Stock Exchange. All right, now let me zoom forward a little bit to modern times. In the modern world, we have the exact same thing. Futures contracts, tremendously complicated. You have the potential for unlimited downside risk with a lot of futures contracts. And who here would feel comfortable trusting this guy with a tattoo on his arm? You can't trust somebody with a tattoo on his arm. It's obvious. But when you go to the futures exchange, you're not actually forming a contract with this guy. Both of you are signing independent contracts with this exchange, the clearinghouse, and they're assuming third-party counter-default risk. So you know ahead of time you're going to get your money, and the futures exchange is monitoring third-party counter-default risk. Okay. I'll give you a couple more modern examples. Electronic commerce. There's all types of ways you can lose money, so please enter your bank account number here. I got this email the other day. I'm actually going to make a lot of money. This guy promised this great business venture. In real life, 15 or 18 years ago, I bought a phone card once and it turned out to be bogus. And there was nothing I could do about it. I called my bank, like, sorry, we can't do anything about it. You bought it, you lose. Well, you can have tons of problems like this on the internet, and especially with anonymous fraudsters. So what we see happening in the late 90s is certain private companies, I'm going to emphasize PayPal because they were really at the forefront of this, coming up with private solutions to online fraud. And they would predict through an algorithm and also human intelligence coupled with computer intelligence whether a transaction was likely to be fraudulent. So if they noticed like a bunch of $5 transactions all happening, all going to a specific country at the same time, it's a red flag. And what they did was predicted ahead of time whether or not they should approve this transaction. Now this is basically ubiquitous, but before this happened, there were all types of problems. They were losing millions of dollars per month, and they had to figure out a private solution, and we still can thank them today. Now Visa and MasterCard have figured out how to do similar things where they deal with fraud ex ante, before it occurs, rather than relying on a problem after the fact, solution after the fact. Okay. Other companies that do things like this are CyberSource. They're now a subsidiary of Visa, but they view losses from fraud as like losses in a profit pipeline. So it's a risk management question rather than a legal question. And we can see here they have helped decrease. This is the percentage of losses due to fraud. It's now around 1%. So it's not perfect, but pretty good. All right, so let me give just the last couple examples, and then I will wrap up. Modern complex financial arrangements are tremendously complex. If you look at how mortgage-backed securities work, they'll bundle them oftentimes, put them in collateralized debt obligations, very sophisticated forms of contracts. These are made possible because of private innovation, not because government regulators are saying, oh, you should do it that way, and we know how you do it. At a time where politicians are debating, should we have price controls on interchange fees, or should we outlaw short sales? People on Wall Street can't rely on the government to be enforcing complex financial contracts. So instead, they rely on things like ISDA, which helps ensure safe, efficient markets. I've focused on financial markets so far, but I want to talk about some other ones outside of this. and say police, same thing. There's a long history of private police in the United States, and one really cool example is in San Francisco. They've been around since the time of the gold rush. Merchants basically had gangs harassing them, and so the merchants got together and hired a system of private police. In 1851, they banished a lot of criminals from the city. In 1856, they had it was called the businessman's revolution against the government, and government spending went down by 85%. And my favorite thing they did was private police enacted gun control against government police. So that's the only type of gun control I support. If anybody wants to learn more, there's a great movie, Cuffs. Well, it's not so great movie, but it's the only great movie. The only movie about private policing is Cuffs with Christian Slater and Mila Jovovich. But they do touch on this. And they still exist in San Francisco today. I surveyed customers of these private police, and I said, why don't you just rely on government police? Why would you pay extra money for these? And the responses were great, like, that's a joke, right? Don't trust government police. They scare me. They take too long to respond. You can hire, these people will show up right away. All right, so let me give some concluding thoughts. I want to highlight that these are just a few examples. We can think about them being, just the tip of the iceberg, but an iceberg in a good way, not the kind that sinks ships. But private governance is everywhere. And it's important for very small problems, like the ones with PayPal. You can't rely on the government, or my Paisley tie. You can't rely on lawsuit for a $20 tie. It's just doesn't make sense. It's also important for large transactions where companies don't have their money tied up in courts for years when something's so important. And I want to try and get people out of this legal centralist mentality that says, oh, problem, law's going to solve it. And I want to highlight how there's so many different ways of eliciting good conduct. Dealing with friends, dealing with honest people, repeat dealings, reputation mechanisms, hiring a third party to assume and manage risks, and all types of other mechanisms out there. And to highlight how this can be done at a not-for-profit level, but oftentimes it's done for the profit motive. When an unmet need exists, that's a potential profit opportunity. And groups like the London Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, PayPal have profited immensely by creating these private rules. And I'm going to conclude with the thought that private governance not only underpins the simplest markets, but the most complex, high-technology markets that the world has ever seen, not just a couple times in history, but the past few hundred years, and that the rules of the market emerge from the market. So thank you very much.
Okay, now we'll hear from Jason Brenner.
Thanks to everybody very much, except for Ed, actually. And the reason I'm not going to say thanks to him is because usually in a thing like this, you're supposed to do kind of the critical role. But the problem is that he's right. And so I can't be a critic. So I actually do thank you for the book. It's a really interesting book and a very great book. And so what I want to do today then, because he's right, is try to talk about as much as possible, well, what is the sort of philosophical upshot of this? What should, say, philosophers and others take from it? It's sort of my role here to do. So there's an Oxford philosopher named David Miller who says, the problem with philosophy is that they don't pay attention to institutions at all. What philosophers do is they just come up with what you might call a kind of justice utility curve, a ranking of all possible states of affairs from better or worse from a moral point of view, but then they're completely agnostic about how institutions work. They just take that utility curve and they hand it over to the social scientists, and the social scientists then tell us how high up we can get on that curve. And Miller says it's really problematic that we do that. But as a matter of fact, philosophers don't do that. On the contrary, what philosophers tend to do is a bunch of sort of ideologically motivated intuition mongering atop a bedrock of false assumptions about how institutions work. Right? So what philosophers should do is pay more attention to this kind of stuff because they're not actually agnostic, and so they come loaded with a lot of mistaken assumptions. So I'm going to briefly summarize Ed's book a little bit more because I want to convince you that it's right even more than he already has, and then I'll talk a little bit about what this would mean for philosophy. So when I read it, it reminded me of the work by Elinor Ostrom, first female Nobel laureate in economics. And that what happens often in economics is we have this game theoretic model. It says under certain conditions, it's going to be a disaster. And then the economists learn to look at that and go, oh man, we need to escape those conditions. But if you just stop looking at your mathematical equations on a piece of paper and get up and look around, you're like, wait, those conditions are met over there, and it's not actually a disaster. And they're met over there, and it's not a disaster. In fact, somehow, under the conditions under which we predict people will be fighting and killing each other, they're actually cooperating and living well. And that tells us there's something wrong with the way we're modeling the world, not that there's something wrong with the world that needs to be fixed. So an example of this that might be familiar to a lot of undergrads, because you probably read this, is Hobbes in Leviathan, in the State of Nature. He says, in the state of nature, outside of government, we'll never be able to trust one another. Everyone we encounter will be in a state of mutual diffidence, and I don't know what your intentions are, so I'll preemptively kill you, and you'll preemptively kill me. But we'll realize how bad this is, so that we're going to decide to agree to make someone, I guess Pete, Leviathan, who will watch over us and make sure we don't fight each other. And it's an odd intellectual dilemma, because if we're able to cooperate that well, to put our arms down long enough to create a Leviathan, why aren't we able to cooperate on other things? There's an internal logic here which seems to be kind of incoherent. And then once we create the Leviathan, what prevents that Leviathan from just eating us all up? And if there's some sort of norms that explain why cooperation is possible despite massive differences in power, well then why would those explain why we're able to cooperate in the first place without any such Leviathan? So Stream calls legal centrism the deus ex machina theory of law. Because what people think is, well, we're in this problem, and law just sort of appears magically out of nowhere and saves the day. But again, you have to ask, well, where did that law actually come from? As he points out repeatedly in his book, often the law that we use actually came from the market itself and was not backed up by the state. The state just later adopted it a couple hundred years later. In fact, most of our legal conventions that are now codified into law arose outside government. In common law countries, such as this one, or New Zealand, or England, or Australia, merchant law, property law, tort law, these things actually did evolve in a polycentric legal system outside of government control without backing from government or enforcement from government. The laws that govern commercial activity, international commercial activity for hundreds of years were only later adopted by governments, only later enforced, and only a little bit. So government often lacks the ability, the knowledge, or the incentive to create good rules that solve our problems. But when that happens, we don't just dissolve into chaos. We find other ways to cooperate because cooperation is beneficial. They find informal means to cooperate. So an example of this would be like if I were to put you in a game right now and you play what Prisoner's Dilemma type game, which some of you have heard of, you'd have a strong incentive to cheat on one another. But if we did that game where after you play the game, what I do is I display on a board the way that you played, so whether you cheated or cooperated, and then you get to choose your next partner, suddenly the game changes. Now your incentive is to cooperate. And the real world is a little bit more like that. It's not a one-shot prisoner's dilemma. It's a multi-shot prisoner's dilemma where people get to choose with whom they interact and where reputations are public. Further, people are not sociopaths. So, for example, there's a Duke psychologist, moral psychologist named Dan Ariely, one of the most famous psychologists around right now, and he frequently puts people in situations where they're able to cheat for money. And what he finds, to everyone's surprise, is most people will cheat a little bit for a little bit of money, but when you make the stakes higher, when you give them more money to cheat, they cheat less. And the reason for that is they feel bad about it. Most people are not sociopaths. They want to think they're pretty decent people at the end of the day. You don't aim to be a moral saint. You're not trying to be Christ-like or something, but you aim to be a B+ or a B on the scale of A to F when it comes to ethics, and you're willing to act in certain ways and others as long as you sort of average out to be a B. Right, so we're not sociopaths, and a lot of times when game theory is looking at why people will cooperate or defect, they're kind of implicitly modeling sociopaths. All right, so that's his argument. Now let's think about what this might mean for philosophy. And when I was reading this, I had in mind a couple of books that came out about 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, I guess. One by Cass Sunstein, legal czar, regulation czar, and legal theorist Holmes, called The Cost of Rights. Another by philosophers Thomas Nagel and Murphy, called The Myth of Ownership. And Sunstein and Holmes say that libertarianism is, and this will be a shock to the George Mason audience, incoherent. Not just false, but incoherent. It's like saying squared circles. And the reason it's incoherent is because libertarians assume that things like property rights exist outside of the state, beyond the state, and don't originate within the state. But they say, on the contrary, property rights cannot exist without government law. laws. In the state of nature, there's just no such thing that we could call property, because if you think about it, a property right, like a right to this coat, it's not really a negative right that forbids you from taking the coat from me. Rather, it's a positive right that allows me to ask for government assistance to get the police to beat you up if you try to take the coat. That's all a property right really is. So absent government protection, Sunstein and Holmes say, rights talk is meaningless. You have nothing. Okay? So Nagel and Murphy, being better philosophers, have a slightly more sophisticated and better argument, what I call the institutional dependence argument. And it goes something like this. They say, the current scheme of income and the current distribution of property in society wouldn't exist without government and the taxes that support it. Therefore, you can't say you have any sort of right to your income or right to your stuff aside from government, because in the natural state of nature, you would have nothing anyways. So your pre-tax income, when you complain about paying your taxes, your pre-tax income is actually just an accounting myth. And there's something right about this, because it is true that under alternative institutions, I would have probably different stuff. I mean, if we had the institutions of the USSR, I wouldn't be so well off, for example. So there's something about that. Now, I think Nagel and Murphy, for what it's worth, they recognize that their argument doesn't actually work. They kind of give away the game in their own book, because they say you can kind of repeat their argument for other kinds of rights, like civil rights. You can say things like, well, in the state of nature, no one would be protecting me from, say, invasions of my civil liberties. So therefore, the state should be allowed to force me to work on the railroads as a corvée tax instead. And their response to that on page 65 of their book is just to say, oh, well, civil rights are different because we're left liberals and we care more about those, which is just basically admitting their argument. They don't actually believe it. So it's not just a good argument. It's very persuasive, and a lot of people accept this kind of argument. But I think Stringham makes a lot of trouble for it, independently of perhaps other problems it has, because he has a twofold response to them. One is to say, contrary to what they think, anarchism, we can't just say anarchism can't work. We actually see lots of examples of it working, and working quite well in cases where we think it wouldn't work, in San Francisco and elsewhere. So anarchism actually can work pretty well and can get people to be prosperous, even if we don't see it sticking around for the long term in many places. But more importantly, because he doesn't have to hang his hat on anarchism to core for this to work, he says that really, a lot of the wealth and income that we enjoy and a lot of the rights that we enjoy are being protected not just by government, but by private governance. And really, the marginal value to you of private governance is probably a lot higher than the marginal value to you of public governance. So yeah, public government is actually helping protect your rights and helping protect your property and other things that you own, but a lot of this stuff is being protected outside of and independent of and is not dependent on government. So for Nagel and Murphy and others want to say, well, the government owns your money because, your watchdog owns your house. Well, the watchdog isn't doing quite as much work as they make it out to. And so the watchdog maybe gets a bone, but it doesn't get to have the entire house. Going beyond that, what's the bigger picture here? How much private governance can we actually get? Can we just dispense with public governance altogether? It's a big question, and like Pete Behnke, I've heard him say this before, I see anarchism as a research project, a really important research project for economists, for political scientists, and others who often start or gripped by the tyranny of the idea of the state, that the nation state that we now have is just sort of the way things are supposed to be and have to be. And there are a number of arguments that people make for the state, that it provides protection goods like the police, that it provides regulations, that it provides utility goods that couldn't be provided by the private sector, and various forms of social insurance and welfare. And I say Stringham's book is part of a tradition that includes Charles Baito, Eleanor Ostrom, David Schmitz, Peter Leeson here, and others, showing us that we can get most of these things, or a lot of these things, without the state. And as this research progresses, as we get more and more of this body of evidence, the burden now shifts to the statists to show us, why we should prefer the state to non-state ways of getting this stuff. And it's important to note, it won't even be good enough for the statists to say, the state can do it better. To illustrate that, I read Car and Driver magazine pretty religiously, and it says, the Honda Accord is a better car than the Toyota Camry, and I think they're right about that. The BMW 3 Series is a better car than the Infiniti Q50. So if you're going to buy one of those types of cars, you should buy the Accord, or the 3 Series, you shouldn't buy the other two cars. I think they're right about that, but it would be absurd to then conclude, because they're better, you have to buy those cars, and you can be forced to buy those cars. So similarly, even if we can show that in many cases the state does a better job regulating certain things or providing certain kinds of social insurance, it's not yet obvious that that's a conclusive argument for the state, like we will force you to live by that set of institutions rather than an alternative set of institutions that work well enough. So in conclusion, I would say, look, the state does, and this is sort of quoting my friend, the political theorist Jacob Levy, and I were talking about the book on Facebook the other day, so I'm going to kind of quote him or paraphrase him to end. Look, the state does many things. Some of the things it does are good, some of the things are bad, but it's not the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why would it be? Thanks.
Bruce? Okay, I had a similar problem to the one Jason mentioned at the beginning. This is a really good book, and it's hard to talk about things that might be wrong with it or that you might want to criticize. But I dug a little deeper and did find a few things that I have problems with. Let me just, before I get into those issues, let me say that this is particularly valuable, I think, because Ed looks in depth at specific case studies of private governance that show, in fact, that it works. He's not just theorizing about it, he's showing you. There is some theory discussion in there. He does have a chapter on Hayek that is excellent. It's my favorite chapter in the book, I think. But most of the book is application, I guess you might say. It's showing how things work. One problem I had initially was that he kept using all my economic heroes as targets to say, look at all these statists. So he cites Buchanan and Hayek and North and these people that are giants. But then I realized, well, you have to cite them in this context because mainstream economists don't even think about the question. They just assume that the state has to be there. And so what they did at least was think about alternative institutions and how they might work. And Ed and I would say they just didn't carry their assumptions far enough, and we're doing that for them. We build on their shoulders, I think. And I think Ed would agree with this. I noticed in his slide with the picture of Buchanan and him that he was just half the man Buchanan was. When I read through the book, I'm sure you can't see this, but I bend over the top of the page when I find something I really like and that I want to, that I think I might use in the future. I bend over the bottom of the page if I find things I don't like that I want to criticize. There's probably 100 or more top pages bent. There's only a half a dozen bottom ones. But that's enough to say something about some of what he has here in a negative way. The problems or the questions I have actually came up almost exclusively in chapters 8 and 9. 8 is about his private policing, and 9 is about what he calls the personal form of private governance, where he's really talking about morality. My problem with the policing is the example he uses. He uses the San Francisco Patrol example, which is a fun example. I mean, I've used it in writings of mine as well, but it's not necessarily a good example of true private policing because, as Ed points out, quote, one peculiar and governmentally determined feature of the system is that in each neighborhood, only one of the independent firms has a license to operate. In other words, government is preventing competition in this market And I would have liked to have seen him look at an example that would be even better, where you would see competition in a market. My own work with Brian Meehan, we've looked at regulations of private security which vary dramatically across states. Some have very strict regulations about entry and things like that. Others have no regulations. So I would have liked to seen him pick a new example of a no regulation kind of place and see what it looked like. That would have been nice for me too, because then I could have used that example instead of the San Francisco one. That is a minor quibble. He also says in that chapter, quote, other jurisdictions such as the state of North Carolina also have private policing. That is way too tame a statement. Every state in the United States has private security. Whether you can call them private policing or not depends on the state regulations. Some states don't let them do much. But furthermore, virtually every country in the world has private security, private policing. A recent study, 2011 study of the market looked at 70 countries and found that in total, somewhere between 19.5 million and 25.5 million private security police in the world, about 1.8 times as many as there are public police. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just California and North Carolina. So he could have pushed that a little harder. Minor point. Let me move on to chapter 9, where my quibbles are, I think, stronger. Ed avoided talking about that chapter in his presentation. Maybe he also has concerns about it, I don't know. But he's talking about a self-imposed constraints in the form of moral beliefs, and how these constraints that we impose on ourselves might work as a form of private governance. And I agree that economists have ignored the issue of morality way too much. It's something we need to understand. Adam Smith told us that, and most of us have failed to recognize it. But I think some of what he says about morality is a little bit inconsistent, and not only internally, but with the rest of the book. To illustrate this, on page 139, he explains that people face choices, trade-offs. Some of them have to do with what you might call moral choices, where your moral beliefs come into play. So he says there's 4 things you can do in these situations. You can consider the trade-off between morality and say self-interest, or he says material gains, I think. Weigh those trade-offs, decide whether it's worth being selfish or you want to be moral. You can always be moral and just ignore the potential material gains. You can never be moral, just don't have any morals and always pursue the material gains. Or you can sort of sometimes adopt the moral constraints and sometimes abandon them. Well, I would argue there's a 5th option, and that is that you can change them. Much of Ed's book is about how individuals and in the pursuit of their objectives are creating and adjusting and changing institutions. If we think of institutions as the rules of the game, then morality is a source of rules. Why are these people not doing it with morality? He seems to assume that morality is I don't know, it's the golden rule, or it's what leads to cooperation. If you think of moral beliefs as what people really believe, then I would say a lot of these progressives out there that are all for taking money from one person and giving it to another have no moral qualms whatsoever about having government tax and redistribute. In fact, they're self-righteous. They think they have the moral high ground in this process. So their own beliefs are different, clearly, than the ones that Ed is assuming. Kant actually says this in a neat way. He says, people may picture themselves as meritorious, feeling themselves guilty of no such offense as they see others burdened with, nor do they ever inquire whether they would not have practiced similar vices had not circumstances of time and place kept them out of the way of these vices. This dishonesty by which we humbug ourselves and which thwarts the establishment of true moral disposition in us extends itself outwardly also to the falsehood and deception of others. He too then is thinking that there is a true morality, and that's, I guess, what Ed is talking about. But I'm saying, I guess, that if a person faces a sufficiently significant moral dilemma where doing what he thinks is moral is going to be very costly, doing what he currently thinks is immoral is going to be quite beneficial, he can change what he thinks. He can change his own internal rules. Ed gets close to saying this at times. He says that these moral norms are norms we create. So he's not saying we just adopt them. He says we create them in our minds. He also points out that the level of cooperation varies across different societies. I would say varies across different institutions. And he points out that where you have market settings, you have a stronger tendency to behave cooperatively. So he's implying then this cooperative behavior reflects these moral views. I would contend that the moral views that arise with markets endogenously at the same time are views that are going to support cooperation. Ed mentions, what's his name? Frank. Frank, who makes an argument essentially that morality is simply beliefs that we adopt to support our rational pursuits, sort of like we pick beliefs that justify what we're doing. Ed rejects that. I think that his rejection is maybe a little premature. I agree that morals are strongly held, that they don't change easily, that they're much more rigid, I guess, than some of the other kinds of institutions we might face, in part because it's very costly to change them. But I would argue that, and they may be very binding in the near term, but I would argue that in the long run, if someone faces this moral dilemma repeatedly, they're going to find a way to justify doing something different. People, Weber talked about the rise of the new Protestant religions at the time that commerce was arising, and some people have interpreted that to mean he's saying that new set of religious beliefs led to the emergence of the market. I think he's not saying that. He's saying these arose together simultaneously. So they're both endogenous. So I'm saying that in the long term, if you face a moral dilemma enough times, you're going to, as Frank suggests, change your beliefs, because it's just costly to keep violating your beliefs. It's just psychologically costly to do. So you change your beliefs, and you become maybe a progressive rather than a market supporter or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.